Hello, beautiful community. Today's question comes from Chuck, and it's one of the questions that I came across while compiling a big long-form Q&A that's coming up shortly. And I thought we'd just take it separately because it's worth taking over 5 minutes on this one. Chuck's asking, one element that you seem not to have spoken much about is Putin's intelligence. I, for one, don't see him as an individual with any depth intelligence or even a modest understanding of the world around him. Would really love to see here a more in-depth analysis of his intelligence. Being a smart criminal is not what I'd like to see addressed, more along the lines of a smart statesman, ? Chuck, if you wanted a sort of a 30-second answer, the answer has got to be that it's not lack of intelligence, but degeneration and distortion caused by the co-option and corruption of a long stay in unchecked power. And therefore, you have got almost bizarre behavior through delusion, but not through lack of intelligence, not through lack of sophistication. But let's just break this down a bit more. Because this is a fascinating question, right? Forget Putin. Just the structure of how you answer questions like this is interesting, and then of course we apply it to Putin. Now let's say something really false and provocative that makes a good point nevertheless. If Mr. Putin had the political skill level of Mr. Trump or Mr. Johnson, Mr. Boris Johnson from the UK, he'd be out of office years ago, and there'd be something else in his place, somebody else, or even perhaps a more democratically tending party leader and so on. So don't laugh too much at people who are still there after 23 years, whose main task is to be there. The war is going on, the war is going badly, but Mr. Putin's main ambition is still being realized. He is relatively safely in power. Now, the war might make him less safe, but he thinks that there's also a chance that it's anyway necessary if he's going to stay in power for another 5, 10, 15 years. So let's take this bit by bit. On the one hand, there is perhaps at least a three-way division between Putin being brilliant, Putin being incompetent, and Putin being brilliant formally, but presently no longer being brilliant, having been so corrupted by stay for a long time in that kind of bizarre power dynamic. Then we've got to put on the table a fascinating question. How do you evaluate politicians by abstracting away the ethical component? I mean, can you do that? And I think the answer has got to be yes, but it also has to be the case that an ineliminable part of a great political leader is ethics. That's something else you put on the table. And then the third thing we can perhaps put on the table are some of Mr. Putin's qualities. So let's say something about those. Historically, he has a remarkable capacity for combining boldness with patience, number one. Number two, he has a remarkable capacity to read the population and then read how far he can move them and how quickly, without typically making a mistake and underestimating or overestimating possibilities. He's a little bit out of his depth now because he's wondering why don't more people get on board with his war against the Western world. But nevertheless, tendentiously, his capacity to read the population and sort of surf public sentiment, surf a kind of exact understanding of the depoliticization of the population, exploit that really well. He has shown some reasonable instincts around understanding what the reception for the annexation of Crimea might be. Really reasonable instincts around how far it's possible to exploit the myth of the Second World War for his benefit. And we can talk about that in more detail. Might even do a main channel video about this. Putin has in an extraordinary way gamified the Second World War, extracted some of the emotions out of it, while detaching it from historical reality, and has in that way partially enabled himself to sort of replay the Second World War in a way that carries some of the population. That's an extraordinarily smart achievement because it's an evil achievement, it's a repulsive achievement, it's also a very smart achievement because the myth of the Second World War is the only unifying thing in Russian society. There is no other cultural myth that unifies everybody. And he's now been able to sort of reanimate it, put it to his own use, and to some extent confiscate it from those bits of the population that want to see it in a different way. So that reanimation and the sort of deeper fictionalization of sentiments around the Second World War has been a very compelling gambit of his. He's got remarkable capacities in other respects too. He has an extraordinary capacity for embodiment. And you would have no understanding of that unless you speak Russian. But he's a guy, less so now, but up until a couple of years ago, he could just sit there for 2 hours and genuinely speak with the discourse of a Western human rights activist. And he could sound persuasive to a lot of people. So he has this chameleon-like quality, a remarkable ability to understand what somebody in the room with him wants to hear, and to tell him this, to tell them that, and make him feel that it's real even though it's absolutely not real. But the trouble, of course, is that the gambit he made in 2012 to come back doomed him to this inevitable vortex of corruption and co-option by this extraordinary dynamic of informalized, unchecked power. This became much worse during the isolation for COVID. And that combined with the fact that he genuinely distrusts the internet. So, what does he distrust? Which websites? No. He distrusts the internet. His attitude to the internet is, how can you know? How can you know that any of this is what it seems to be? How can you know any of it is real? So he has a kind of unqualified suspicion of the whole internet. And that combined with his circles shrinking from sort of 5 or 6 to 1 or 2 during the pandemic, where he was heavily influenced by Kovalchuk on anti-Western escalation, and perhaps by Medvedchuk on the reality on the ground in Ukraine. All of that is damaging and deeply corrosive to one's sense of reality. And it perpetuated, the thing that isolation in that kind of unchecked power goes together with, which is grandiosity and delusion and paranoia. Putin's always had a lot of pathologies. He always was paranoid. He always had trust issues. He always was blind to people's more benign instincts. He couldn't identify benign instincts in people well. He always saw in benign instincts power and money. Now, so the other things worth saying are the bit about ethics and politics, and the other bit that I've forgotten about, but I'll probably remember it as I speak. So let's say a bit about ethics and politics. You have to have ethics as a big part of how you evaluate a great leader. But nevertheless, there are other important political qualities which are clearly there, and that allows us to evaluate people by abstracting the ethical bit away. So you don't want a saintly politician, because most people watching this would not be able to be the president of the United States. The amount of destruction you'd have to directly cause would just be unbearable to you, unpalatable to you. Barack Obama allegedly said, and sounds plausible to me, that we have a president who is good at killing. And what Barack Obama meant wasn't that he was evil and immoral, and he went around murdering people, but that rather he could kill while A, being able to sleep at night after without having a nervous breakdown about it, and 2, without losing his moral compass. So the point of ethics in politics isn't to be saintly. It's rather to be able to persist with having dirty hands without losing a moral compass. Barack Obama could sit there on a Tuesday and look at his drone program kill list and know there's going to be bystanders and civilians killed, and still say, yeah, we're going to do this and we're going to do that, right? So, the most ethical politician in high power, this doesn't apply to your local, councillor, but in high power, ethics is about being able to retain an ethical rider while having dirty hands. But the first bit I think I've remembered now is this conversation about how in Putin's place Trump or Johnson would have lost power. So Putin is a guy who, like Orban, can act with discipline, patience, hard-nosed resolve, and that has been central to him keeping power. Imagine you reverse the personalities of Medvedev and Putin in 2012. Then Mr. Putin, if he were not Putin but Medvedev, doesn't get to come back. As we're still meandering, Boris Johnson is incompetent behind closed doors, but not wildly incompetent behind closed doors like Trump is. Trump, on the other hand, is a communicator of genius, and he has a still very much alive capacity to prey on people's vulnerabilities and really go all in with that. is an extraordinary political talent. But because that is about communication and nothing else, there isn't a Trump policy behind closed doors. There's a Trumpian evasion of certain policies, right? So he might not be able to do some important things that need to be done, but Trump is an easily co-optable political operator because he doesn't have the political skills to bring an elite and to cultivate an elite with him. He was a one-man show, and if he wins in 2024, he'll again likely remain a somewhat erratic one-man show, and therefore his impact on US democracy would be largely at the level of not doing certain policy, right, that arguably really needs to be done on climate and so on, but really impacting US politics via how and what he communicates. But he won't be primarily impacting US politics by having a Trumpian political program at home and away very much. That's a very, very big difference. That's a very, very big difference. The other thing that's worth saying is that there are some politicians who develop a kind of Messianic Syndrome. And that's certainly neither Trump nor Bojo. An example of that to some extent was Tony Blair, who have compared in that very limited respect to Putin on a few occasions, because Putin has this kind of absolutely writ large, more or less equalization of his personal will with the destiny of Russian culture. Blair, of course, had nothing of the sort. But certainly with Iraq, there was something overly dogmatically moralized and self-aggrandizingly messianic and unhealthy in the way he saw that. So that also happens, and that happened to Putin with his missionary turn around 2012, 2013, 2014. Now, final remark, how far can you even see Putin as a politician at all, given that he sits atop this sort of quasi-gangster regime? Here I would say that the answer to the political question of how do we get beyond might is right and sort of arbitrate political conflict in terms of claims and counterclaims and values that can compete and even arguments that can compete with one another. How do we get beyond might is right is a political question to which one political answer is we don't. And even though that's an answer that's very hard for us to recognize in the West, particularly because we really still believe very much in not just political enemies, but in political opposition. And political opposition aren't enemies, they're people we're cooperating with as we compete, right? You're not my enemy when I try to beat you at tennis, because I'm interested in my serve going in, I'm interested in my backhand coming close to the line. I'm not interested in bashing you over the head with a tennis racket. So we're opponents, but certainly not enemies. Mr. Putin doesn't recognize these distinctions, but nevertheless, the fact that he doesn't mean he isn't doing politics, and doesn't mean that comparisons between him and even democratic leaders aren't possible. I hope this meanderization was helpful. If you're dying with a question that I haven't answered, I'm going to make an extra effort to answer everything that appears under this video. So drop a question there. I'm going to be back probably with a live tomorrow and a very long form Q&A on chat soon, and something exciting as always on the main channel soonishly. Lots of love. Bye-bye.